Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal reality behind the Viking warrior, those fierce seafaring raiders whose very name still sends shivers down our spines over 1,000 years later. From bone-chilling voyages across violent seas to the grim daily struggle of survival in the frozen wilderness of Scandinavia, their story is one of endurance, desperation, and a kind of savage pragmatism that modern life can barely comprehend. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Viking warriors, you might imagine horned helmets, glorious battles, and heroic deaths that guarantee a seat in Valhalla. But for the average Viking fighter, reality was less about epic glory and more about how do we not starve, freeze, or die of infection before we even reach the battlefield. It wasn't just about swinging an axe and shouting war cries. It was a grinding existence of constant preparation, brutal training, and the ever-present knowledge that your next raid might be your last. Picture this. You're living in a drafty longhouse that smells like smoke, sweat, and whatever died under the floorboards last winter, sharing space with extended family, livestock, and probably a few unwelcome rodents. The romantic Viking saga? Not quite. The reality was far more interesting, far more human, and infinitely more uncomfortable. If you think your childhood was tough because you had to walk to school uphill both ways, spare a thought for the Viking boy who knew that his passage to manhood involved proving he could kill a man with his bare hands, navigate by the stars across a sea that wanted him dead, and do it all while maintaining the stoic composure of someone who definitely wasn't terrified out of his mind. Viking warrior training didn't begin with a gentle introduction to wooden swords and playful sparring. It started the moment a boy could walk, stumble, and accidentally set things on fire. Because in the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, where winter lasted approximately 11 months and summer was that pleasant week when the snow only came up to your knees, childhood was less about innocence and wonder and more about not dying before you were old enough to be useful. The romanticized image of Viking warriors, those magnificent bearded giants charging into battle with reckless abandon, conveniently overlooks the fact that these fearsome raiders were once scrawny, snot-nosed children who cried when they stubbed their toes and occasionally wet themselves during thunderstorms. The difference was that Viking society had a very particular way of turning those vulnerable little humans into the kind of people who could sail across unknown seas, raid foreign shores, and return home with enough plunder to keep their families fed through another brutal winter. It wasn't magic, and it certainly wasn't pleasant. It was a grinding, methodical process of physical and psychological conditioning that would make modern military boot camps look like luxury wellness retreats. Viking childhood began with a simple understanding. The world was trying to kill you, and your job was to become harder to kill than the world was determined. This wasn't pessimism, it was meteorology. When your homeland featured weather patterns that could freeze a man solid in minutes, and a landscape that seemed designed by someone with a grudge against human comfort, optimism was a luxury no one could afford. Boys learned early that survival wasn't guaranteed, that weakness was a death sentence, and that the difference between living and dying often came down to who could endure the most discomfort without complaining about it. From the moment they could hold a stick without immediately trying to eat it, Viking boys were introduced to weapons. Not toy weapons, not safe practice weapons, but actual, genuinely dangerous implements that could and occasionally did cause serious injury. The logic was beautifully simple and terrifyingly practical. If you're going to spend your adult life surrounded by sharp objects designed to kill people, you might as well get comfortable with them while your bones are still soft enough to heal quickly. Wooden swords gave way to blunted metal, which eventually gave way to the real thing. Boys learned to fight with axes, swords, spears, and C-axis, the Viking equivalent of a Swiss Army knife. If a Swiss Army knife were primarily designed for gutting enemies rather than opening canned goods. The training wasn't just about swinging weapons around until something broke. It was about building the kind of muscle memory that would keep you alive when thinking became a luxury you couldn't afford. Viking boys practiced until their hands bled, then practiced some more until the bleeding stopped because their palms had developed calluses thick enough to stop arrows. They learned to fight while exhausted, while hungry, while cold enough that their breath crystallized in the air and their fingers went numb around their weapon hilts. Because if you were going to raid foreign shores, you needed to be the kind of person who could function when everything hurt and nothing was going according to plan. Physical conditioning went far beyond simple weapons training. Viking boys were expected to become comfortable with discomfort in all its creative variations. They slept outdoors in winter, not as punishment, but as preparation. They learned to swim in water so cold it could stop your heart, then learned to swim farther, stay under longer, hold their breath until their lungs screamed for mercy. They climbed cliffs, ran across broken terrain, and carried heavy loads for distances that would humble modern endurance athletes. And they did it all while maintaining the kind of emotional stoicism that suggested they were either supremely disciplined or suffering from some form of collective psychological numbness. Wrestling was considered essential education, but Viking wrestling wasn't the sanitized, rule-bound sport you might imagine. It was closer to organized violence, with loose guidelines. Boys grappled in mud, snow, and rocky ground, learning to fight when they couldn't see clearly, couldn't breathe properly, and couldn't feel their extremities. They practiced until they could throw opponents twice their size, escape from holds that should have been inescapable, and continue fighting, even when they were pretty sure something important had been broken or dislocated. Victory wasn't about following rules. It was about being the last person standing when everyone else had given up or lost consciousness. The psychological component of Viking warrior training was perhaps the most brutal aspect of the entire process. Boys were taught to suppress fear, pain, and emotional weakness, not through gentle encouragement or patient coaching, but through systematic exposure to exactly the things that terrified them most. Afraid of heights? Time to practice fighting on narrow ledges. Uncomfortable with violence? Here's a freshly sharpened axe, and an opponent who's been told that losing means extra chores for a month. Worried about dying? Well, that's unfortunate, because death was always part of the conversation. Viking boys learned early that showing weakness wasn't just socially embarrassing, it was dangerous. In a society where resources were scarce and survival often depended on group cohesion, individuals who couldn't pull their weight were liabilities the community couldn't afford. Boys who cried during training, who backed down from fights, who showed reluctance to inflict or endure violence, found themselves gradually excluded from the social circles that mattered. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the kind of harsh pragmatism that emerges when the alternative to toughness is death by starvation, exposure, or enemy blade. The pressure to prove worthiness never relented. Viking society didn't believe in participation trophies or gentle encouragement for effort. You either demonstrated competence or you didn't, and the consequences of failure weren't hurt feelings, but genuine social exile. Boys competed constantly in wrestling matches, weapon skills, endurance challenges, and contests of pain tolerance that would horrify modern child psychologists. They competed while injured, while sick, while dealing with the kind of psychological stress that comes from knowing your entire future depends on your ability to outlast, outfight, and out-endure your peers. Mock battles were a regular feature of Viking childhood, but these weren't gentle play-fighting sessions with foam weapons and safety gear. They were brutal, chaotic melees, where boys learned to fight in groups, coordinate attacks, protect each other, and think tactically, while adrenaline flooded their systems and everything around them descended into violence. Injuries were common and expected. Boys who emerged from mock battles without cuts, bruises, or minor fractures were suspected of not trying hard enough. The goal wasn't to avoid getting hurt. It was to learn how to keep fighting effectively even when you were already hurt. Winter training was particularly savage because winter was when Vikings had the most time to focus on education and the fewest distractions from survival needs. Boys practiced weapons drills in snow so deep they could barely move, learned to start fires with wet kindling and numb fingers, and developed the kind of cold tolerance that allowed them to function in conditions that would incapacitate ordinary humans. They slept in snow caves, ate frozen food, and learned to recognize the early signs of frostbite, hypothermia, and other cold weather maladies, not so they could avoid these conditions, but so they could push through them when avoiding them wasn't an option. The transition from boy to warrior wasn't marked by a single dramatic ceremony, but by a gradual accumulation of demonstrated competencies. Boys who could handle weapons effectively, endure physical hardship without complaint, and function under psychological pressure, slowly earned inclusion in more serious training exercises. They graduated from practicing with other boys to sparring with experienced warriors, from carrying messages to participating in actual raids, from observing important decisions to being consulted about tactics and strategy. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Viking warrior training was learning to kill, not animals. That was basic survival education that began in early childhood, but humans. Viking boys were gradually introduced to the psychological reality of ending another person's life, usually through carefully staged encounters with prisoners, slaves, or condemned criminals. They learned that killing wasn't as easy as it looked in stories, that human beings were remarkably resilient and desperately attached to staying alive, and that the act of murder left psychological scars that never fully healed. They also learned that in their world, the ability to kill effectively was the difference between protecting your family and watching them starve, freeze, or be carried off by raiders from neighboring territories. The social pressure surrounding warrior training was relentless and pervasive. Boys who showed promise were celebrated, encouraged, and given access to better equipment and more experienced mentors. Boys who struggled were pushed harder, given more difficult challenges, and gradually excluded from the social networks that led to marriage prospects, political influence, and economic opportunity. There was no alternative career path for Viking boys who didn't want to be warriors. In a society constantly threatened by hostile neighbors, harsh weather, and resource scarcity, everyone needed to be capable of violence when circumstances demanded it. Training also included psychological conditioning designed to suppress empathy and emotional attachment. Viking boys learned to view enemies not as fellow human beings but as obstacles to be removed, resources to be claimed, or threats to be eliminated. They practiced dehumanizing language, studied the weaknesses of different ethnic groups they might encounter in raids, and developed the kind of cold pragmatism that allowed them to kill, plunder, and burn without being paralyzed by moral qualms. It wasn't that Vikings were inherently evil, it was that their survival strategy required a level of ruthless efficiency that couldn't coexist with modern notions of humanitarian concern. The physical demands of warrior training were matched by equally brutal intellectual requirements. Viking boys memorized complex genealogies, learned to navigate by stars and weather patterns, studied the political relationships between different regions they might raid, and developed the tactical thinking necessary for successful warfare. They learned to estimate distances across water, predict weather changes days in advance, identify valuable targets in foreign settlements, and coordinate complex military operations with limited communication. Being a successful Viking warrior required not just physical prowess, but genuine intellectual sophistication. Perhaps most challenging of all was learning to live with uncertainty. Viking boys were taught that death could come at any moment, that even the most careful planning could be destroyed by bad weather or enemy action, and that survival often depended on making split-second decisions with incomplete information. They learned to function effectively while terrified, to make life or death choices while exhausted and confused, and to maintain group cohesion even when everything was falling apart around them. It was psychological conditioning designed to create human beings who could thrive in chaos, and it came at a tremendous personal cost. The boys who survived this brutal education emerged as something unique in the medieval world. Warriors who combined physical toughness, psychological resilience, and intellectual sophistication in ways that made them nearly unstoppable in small-scale conflicts. They could endure hardships that would break ordinary men, think clearly under extreme stress, and coordinate complex operations across vast distances with minimal resources. But they also carried the psychological scars of childhood trauma, the emotional numbness that comes from systematic dehumanization, and the kind of pragmatic ruthlessness that modern society would classify as sociopathic behavior. By the time a Viking boy completed his warrior training, he had been transformed from a normal human child into something that was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. He possessed skills and capabilities that would have seemed superhuman to people from gentler societies, but he had paid for those abilities with pieces of his humanity that could never be recovered. The making of a Viking warrior was an alchemical process that turned ordinary boys into legendary fighters, but the transformation required sacrificing much of what we would consider essential to a healthy, well-adjusted human life. And yet, in the harsh world of medieval Scandinavia, these psychological and physical costs were considered not just acceptable, but necessary. Because when winter lasted most of the year, when hostile neighbors threatened constant violence, and when survival depended on being harder, tougher, and more ruthless than everyone around you, the luxury of a gentle childhood was something no one could afford. The boys who emerged from Viking warrior training were damaged, scarred, and psychologically numbed, but they were also alive, capable, and ready to face a world that showed no mercy to anyone who couldn't match its cruelty with their own. If you think your studio apartment feels cramped because you can't swing a cat without hitting 3 pieces of furniture and your neighbor's stereo, imagine sharing a single rectangular room with 35 blood relatives, assorted livestock, several barrels of fermenting fish, and at least one uncle who hasn't bathed since the previous summer and shows no signs of planning to remedy the situation anytime soon. Welcome to the Viking longhouse, where privacy was a concept as foreign as central heating, personal space was measured in inches rather than feet, and the phrase, nuclear family, would have been met with blank stares and possibly accusations of witchcraft. This wasn't just a home, it was a social experiment in human endurance disguised as architecture, a testament to what people could survive when the alternative was freezing to death alone in the wilderness. The longhouse wasn't called that because Vikings had a particularly creative approach to naming buildings. It was called that because it was, quite literally, long, spectacularly, aggressively long. Picture a wooden aircraft hangar, designed by someone who had never seen an aircraft, but had very strong opinions about maximizing the number of humans you could cram into a single structure without triggering mass violence. Most longhouses stretched anywhere from 60 to 180 feet in length, but only about 20 feet wide, creating the architectural equivalent of a very large, very smoky tube filled with people who were slowly driving each other insane. The exterior walls were constructed from whatever materials the local environment provided and the family could afford, which usually meant timber, stone, and turf lots, and lots of turf. If you're having trouble visualizing this, imagine a log cabin that someone buried under several feet of dirt and grass, then forgot to dig out properly. The turf wasn't just decorative, it provided crucial insulation against the kind of cold that could kill you in minutes if you were foolish enough to venture outside inadequately dressed. But it also meant that your house looked like a particularly large grave mound, which was either deeply symbolic or profoundly depressing, depending on your philosophical outlook and how long you'd been trapped inside with your relatives. Inside, the longhouse was divided into sections that served different functions, though the boundaries between these areas were more theoretical than actual. The central hall dominated the space, featuring a long fire pit that ran down the middle like a glowing spine of civilization. This fire wasn't just for warmth, it was for cooking, light, metalworking, and providing a focal point for the kind of family arguments that could escalate into blood feuds, if not carefully managed. The smoke from this fire had to escape somehow, which it did through a hole in the roof, assuming the wind was blowing in the right direction and the hole hadn't been blocked by snow, bird nests, or accumulated soot. When conditions weren't optimal, which was approximately 70% of the time, the smoke just hung around inside like an unwelcome guest who couldn't take a hint. The social hierarchy of the longhouse was rigidly defined and ruthlessly enforced, though it might not have been immediately obvious to casual observers who were distracted by the overwhelming sensory assault of the place. The head of the household, usually the eldest male who hadn't yet died in a raid, succumbed to disease, or been murdered by a frustrated family member, occupied the place of honor closest to the central fire. This was called the high seat, though calling it a seat was generous, since it was often just a slightly more elaborate bench, with some carved decorations, and possibly a cushion stuffed with whatever soft materials could be scavenged. From this prestigious position, the family patriarch could survey his domain, make important decisions about resource allocation, and enjoy the luxury of being warm enough that his breath didn't freeze in the air when he spoke. Radiating outward from this central position, family members were arranged according to their importance, age, and relationship to the head of household. Wives, children, elderly parents, and dependent relatives all had their designated spots, though these assignments could shift based on changing circumstances, political alliances, and who had most recently annoyed the patriarch. Unmarried adult children occupied a particularly awkward position in this hierarchy, old enough to be useful, but not yet important enough to command prime real estate near the fire. They spent their winters huddled in the colder, darker sections of the longhouse. Dreaming of the day they could either marry into a better position or accumulate enough wealth to establish their own households and inflict similar discomfort on their own children. Slaves, because of course there were slaves, occupied the least desirable positions near the walls and doorways, where they enjoyed the full brunt of every draft, leak, and temperature fluctuation. Their sleeping arrangements were less designated space, and more wherever they could find room to lie down without being stepped on, which often meant sharing floor space with the livestock. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, well, not entirely, but rather the practical application of a resource hierarchy that prioritized the comfort and survival of free family members over the basic human dignity of their human property. Speaking of livestock, the animals weren't kept in separate buildings because Vikings weren't particularly concerned with the modern notion that humans and farm animals should maintain some degree of residential separation. Cows, goats, sheep, pigs, and chickens all shared the longhouse during winter months, providing additional body heat, a ready source of fresh milk and eggs, and a constant reminder that privacy was a luxury no one could afford. The animals were generally confined to one end of the building, though confined is probably too strong a word since barriers between human and animal sections were often little more than knee-high wooden partitions that determined creatures could easily circumvent. The result was a living arrangement that challenged every modern assumption about sanitation, personal space, and the psychological requirements for mental health. If you think your current roommate situation is challenging because someone leaves dirty dishes in the sink, try sharing your bedroom with a cow that has strong opinions about when to wake up, a family of pigs with questionable toilet habits, and chickens that seem to believe the entire world is their personal roosting spot. The animals provided warmth, food, and companionship, but they also contributed significantly to the overall aromatic complexity of longhouse life. Sleeping arrangements in the longhouse were less about comfort and more about maximizing the number of horizontal humans you could fit into a given space without creating a situation that would result in accidental suffocation. Most people slept on raised wooden platforms that ran along the walls, creating a tiered effect that allowed families to stack sleepers like cordwood while maintaining some pretense of personal space. These platforms were covered with whatever soft materials could be gathered: animal skins, wool blankets, straw, hay, and occasionally the pelts of animals that had been killed, specifically for their fur rather than their meat. The platforms weren't private bedrooms, they were communal sleeping areas where entire families bedded down together like litters of very large, very hairy puppies. Parents slept with their children, grandparents shared space with grandchildren, and unmarried siblings found themselves in sleeping arrangements that would have horrified modern notions of personal boundaries. Privacy was achieved not through physical separation, but through a collective agreement to pretend that certain activities weren't happening, even when they quite obviously were. The development of exceptionally selective hearing and the ability to sleep through virtually any noise became essential life skills. During winter months, when outdoor activities were limited by weather conditions that could kill unprepared humans in minutes, the longhouse became a pressure cooker of human emotions, competing needs, and accumulated grievances. Imagine being trapped in a large, smoky tube with every person you've ever disagreed with, plus their pets, their livestock, and their most annoying relatives, for approximately 6 months of the year. Now imagine that some of these people are armed, trained in violence, and culturally predisposed to resolve conflicts through physical confrontation. It's remarkable that more Viking families didn't simply murder each other out of seasonal frustration. The women of the Longhouse managed this potential chaos through a combination of diplomatic skill, practical authority, and the kind of iron will that could intimidate warriors who regularly faced death in battle. The mistress of the household controlled the keys to all storage containers, managed food distribution, supervised textile production, and maintained the delicate social balance that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into full-scale family wars. She was essentially a combination of quartermaster, diplomat, production manager, and referee, all while managing her own children and maintaining some pretense of wifely submission to her husband's authority. Food storage and preparation in the Longhouse was a constant challenge that required careful planning, resourceful creativity, and the ability to make unpalatable ingredients seem appetizing through sheer force of culinary will. Most nutrition came from preserved foods that had been prepared during summer and autumn: dried fish, salted meat, pickled vegetables, and various fermented products that modern palates would find challenging at best. Fresh food during winter months was limited to whatever eggs the chickens were still producing, milk from livestock that hadn't yet frozen solid, and the occasional unfortunate animal that could be slaughtered without compromising the family's long-term survival prospects. The smell inside a Viking longhouse was something that defied easy description, but haunted the nostrils of anyone unfortunate enough to experience it. Imagine the combined aromas of unwashed human bodies, animal waste, rotting food scraps, wood smoke, fermented fish, wet wool, and whatever unfortunate creatures had died under the floorboards and couldn't be easily removed. Now imagine that this olfactory assault was concentrated in a sealed environment where fresh air was a rare luxury and ventilation was more theoretical than actual. Visitors to longhouses often reported that the smell could be detected from considerable distances, serving as an early warning system that probably helped prevent surprise attacks, but did nothing for property values. Hygiene in the longhouse was a pragmatic compromise between cleanliness ideals and the harsh realities of winter survival. Water for washing had to be hauled from sources that might be frozen for months, heated over fires that needed to be conserved for cooking and warmth, and used sparingly because every drop was precious. Most people settled for occasional washing of hands and faces, with full body cleaning reserved for special occasions or when the accumulated grime reached levels that threatened basic functionality. Clothing was cleaned even less frequently, often going months without washing because wet garments in freezing temperatures were a death sentence. The longhouse served as more than just a residence. It was a workshop, social center, political meeting place, and economic hub. During long winter months, the central hall became a production facility where weapons were repaired, textiles were woven, tools were crafted, and various crafts were practiced. The constant activity served multiple purposes. It kept people occupied during months when outdoor work was impossible, provided essential goods for trade and survival, and helped prevent the kind of boredom-induced violence that could erupt when armed warriors had too much time and too little to do. Preparing for raiding season while living in the longhouse required coordination that would challenge modern project managers equipped with computers, telecommunications, and adequate caffeine supplies. Warriors needed to maintain their weapons, repair their armor, plan expeditions, and coordinate with other households, all while managing the daily challenges of surviving in a crowded, smoky, smelly environment filled with people who knew exactly which personal habits annoyed them most. Equipment maintenance was a constant concern. Metal corroded quickly in the damp, humid environment of the longhouse. Leather hardened and cracked, and wooden components warped or rotted if not properly cared for. The political dynamics of longhouse life were incredibly complex, involving not just immediate family relationships, but connections to other households, obligations to higher-ranking nobles, and the delicate negotiations required to organize successful raiding expeditions. Warriors spent winter months building alliances, settling disputes, arranging marriages, and generally managing the social networks that would determine their success or failure when spring arrived and raiding season began. These negotiations took place around the central fire, often accompanied by generous quantities of mead or ale that helped facilitate difficult conversations, but occasionally led to agreements that seemed less wise in the cold light of morning. Children growing up in longhouses learned early that personal space was a luxury, privacy was impossible, and survival depended on getting along with people you couldn't escape even if you desperately wanted to. They developed remarkable abilities to sleep through noise, ignore unpleasant smells, and navigate complex family politics, while avoiding the kind of attention that might result in extra chores or unexpected violence. Childhood in the longhouse was excellent preparation for life as a Viking warrior, since it taught essential skills like patience, diplomatic sensitivity, and the ability to function effectively while surrounded by potential sources of extreme irritation. The entertainment options in winter longhouses were limited but creative. Storytelling was elevated to an art form, with professional skalds recounting epic tales that could last for hours and helped pass the long, dark evenings. Board games like Hnefatafl provided intellectual challenges and opportunities for competitive gambling. Music, dancing, and impromptu poetry competitions helped relieve tension and provided socially acceptable outlets for showing off. Drinking contests were popular but dangerous, since alcohol and confined spaces filled with armed people created obvious potential for problems. As winter gradually loosened its grip and spring approached, the longhouse began to stir with anticipation and planning for the coming raiding season. Warriors inspected their gear with renewed intensity, tested weapons that hadn't been used in months, and began the psychological preparation necessary for transitioning from cramped domestic life to the dangers and opportunities of seafaring warfare. The longhouse, which had served as refuge and prison during the dark months, was gradually transformed into a staging area for expeditions that would determine the family's prosperity and survival for another year. The social tensions that had been building throughout the winter began to find release through the promise of escape. Young warriors dreamed of proving themselves in battle. Older fighters planned expeditions that might provide enough wealth to improve their family's circumstances, and everyone looked forward to the simple luxury of being able to step outside without risking immediate death from exposure. The longhouse had served its purpose, keeping everyone alive through another brutal winter, but its cramped, smoky, smelly embrace was something everyone was eager to escape. If you think your family gatherings are challenging because your uncle tells inappropriate jokes and your cousin won't stop talking about their cryptocurrency investments, imagine spending 6 months trapped in a single room with these people, plus their farm animals, with no escape except death by freezing. The Viking longhouse was humanity's answer to the question of how many people you could cram into one building before they started killing each other, and the answer turned out to be slightly more than you'd think, but not by much. Yet somehow, against all odds and basic principles of human psychology, these impossibly crowded, uncomfortable, aromatic domestic pressure cookers managed to produce the warriors who would terrorize medieval Europe and explore continents that most people didn't know existed. The longhouse didn't just shelter Viking families through brutal winters. It forged them into the kind of people who could survive anything because they'd already survived living with their relatives in a confined space for months at a time. And after that, mere death in battle seemed almost relaxing by comparison. If you think planning a vacation is stressful because you have to coordinate flights, hotels, and figure out what to pack for unpredictable weather, imagine organizing an expedition where the goal is to sail across hostile waters in a wooden boat held together with iron nails and optimism, land on foreign shores, populated by people who would very much prefer you didn't exist, steal everything valuable you can carry, and then somehow make it home alive with enough plunder to justify the months of preparation and the very real possibility that you'll end up as fish, food, or fertilizer in someone else's field. This was Viking raid season preparation, an exercise in logistics that would challenge modern military planners equipped with satellites, computers, and the reasonable expectation that most of their equipment wouldn't spontaneously fall apart halfway through the mission. The transition from winter survival mode to raid preparation began long before the ice started melting and the days grew noticeably longer. It started in the minds of warriors who had spent months trapped in smoky longhouses, breathing recycled air thick with the accumulated exhalations of relatives and livestock, contemplating the grinding reality that their current supplies would only last so long and something would have to be done about acquiring more. The psychological shift was profound and necessary. Men who had spent the dark months focused on conservation, rationing, and making limited resources stretch had to transform themselves into people willing to risk everything on the possibility of spectacular gain. This mental transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always smooth. Warriors who had grown comfortable with the relative safety and predictability of longhouse life had to rediscover their appetite for violence, uncertainty, and the kind of calculated recklessness that made successful raiding possible. Some found this transition easier than others. Young men who had never experienced the particular terror of watching your ship disappear beneath dark waves were often eager to prove themselves, while veterans who had survived multiple expeditions sometimes required more time and effort to convince themselves that another season of risking everything was preferable to another year of slow starvation. The first and most critical aspect of raid preparation was assessing and repairing the ships that would carry the warriors to their destinations and, hopefully, back home again. Viking longships were marvels of engineering shallow-drafted vessels designed to navigate everything from open ocean swells to narrow rivers, capable of being portaged overland when necessary, and fast enough to outrun larger, more heavily armed vessels that might pursue them. They were also, it must be said, basically large wooden boats held together with iron rivets, tar, and the kind of faith in craftsmanship that only makes sense when the alternative is walking to your destinations. After spending months beached on shore, exposed to snow, ice, rain, and the various forms of decay that attacked wood in northern climates, these ships required extensive maintenance before they could be trusted with human lives. The hull had to be inspected plank by plank, searching for cracks, rot, or loose joints that could open into fatal leaks once the ship was under load and pounding through ocean swells. Damaged planks had to be replaced, which meant finding suitable timber, seasoning it properly, and shaping it to fit precisely into gaps left by removed sections. This wasn't carpentry. It was surgery performed on the only thing standing between the crew and a very unpleasant death by drowning. The waterproofing process was particularly crucial and remarkably unpleasant. Vikings sealed the joints between planks with a mixture of tar, animal fat, and various organic materials that created a flexible, water-resistant barrier. This mixture had to be heated to the proper consistency, applied carefully to every seam, and then smoothed and shaped to ensure it would remain effective even when the ship was flexing and twisting in heavy seas. The smell of hot tar mixed with rendered animal fat was something that lingered in clothes, hair, and memory long after the work was completed, serving as an aromatic reminder of the unglamorous reality behind seafaring adventure. The ship's rigging required equally careful attention. Sails made from wool or linen had to be inspected for tears, weak spots, and the kind of general deterioration that could leave a ship powerless in the middle of the ocean when the wind picked up and speed became essential for survival. Rope made from twisted animal hair or plant fibers needed to be tested for strength and flexibility. A single failed line at a critical moment could mean the difference between escaping, pursuing enemies, and becoming an interesting historical footnote about Vikings who didn't make it home. Weapons maintenance was a parallel obsession that consumed enormous amounts of time and attention during the preparation months. A Viking warrior's weapons weren't just tools, they were extensions of his identity, symbols of his status, and quite literally, the difference between life and death when violence erupted. Swords, axes, spears, and sea axes all required different types of care, and neglecting any of them could prove fatal when there was no time for equipment failure. Sword maintenance was particularly demanding because these weapons represented significant investments in both money and craftsmanship. The best Viking swords were pattern-welded marvels, created by smiths who understood metallurgy in ways that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The blade had to be kept sharp enough to cut through mail, leather, and bone, but not so sharp that the edge would chip or roll when striking hard targets. This required careful grinding, honing, and polishing work that demanded skill, patience, and the kind of perfectionist attention to detail that might seem obsessive until you considered what happened to warriors whose weapons failed them in combat. Axes were more forgiving than swords, but required their own specialized care. The wooden handles had to be inspected for cracks, splits, or looseness that could send the axe head flying at an inopportune momentum mishap that was embarrassing in practice and fatal in battle. The metal heads needed sharpening, but they also had to be balanced properly. An axe that was too heavy would tire a warrior quickly, while one that was too light wouldn't deliver enough force to penetrate enemy armor effectively. Spears presented their own challenges. The wooden shaft had to be strong enough to withstand the shock of impact without breaking, flexible enough to absorb some of the force without snapping, and light enough that a warrior could wield it effectively for extended periods. The spear point had to be sharp enough to penetrate armor and clothing, but it also had to be designed so it could be withdrawn quickly from wounds without getting stuck. This balance between penetration and extraction was more complex than it might seem, requiring careful attention to the shape and metallurgy of the blade. Armor maintenance was equally critical, but often more frustrating because good armor was expensive, difficult to repair, and essential for survival. Mail shirts, the preferred protection for wealthy Vikings, were constructed from thousands of individual iron rings, linked together in patterns that distributed impact force across a wide area. Maintaining mail required inspecting each ring for rust, damage, or weakness, then repairing or replacing damaged sections with rings that matched the original construction. This was tedious, time-consuming work that required good eyesight, steady hands, and the kind of patience that didn't come naturally to men who spent most of their time thinking about violence. Leather armor was easier to maintain, but presented its own challenges. The leather had to be kept supple enough to allow movement, but tough enough to turn glancing blows from weapons. This required regular treatment with animal fats and oils, careful storage to prevent cracking or hardening, and occasional replacement of sections that had been damaged beyond repair. Warriors who couldn't afford metal armor spent considerable time crafting and maintaining leather protection that was better than nothing but significantly less effective than mail when facing determined enemies with sharp weapons. Shield construction and maintenance was a specialized skill that every warrior had to master. Because shields were consumable items, they were expected to be damaged or destroyed in combat and needed to be replaced regularly. A typical Viking shield was constructed from wooden planks bound together with iron fittings, covered with leather, and painted with designs that served both decorative and psychological purposes. The wood had to be strong enough to stop weapon strikes, but light enough that a warrior could maneuver it effectively throughout a long battle. The psychological aspect of shield decoration was more important than modern people might realize. Viking warfare was partly about actual combat effectiveness and partly about intimidating enemies into surrendering or fleeing rather than fighting. Shields painted with fierce animals, geometric patterns, or symbolic designs served as billboards, advertising the warrior's ferocity, skill, and determination. A well-decorated shield could sometimes win a fight before it started by convincing potential opponents that discretion was preferable to valor. Gathering supplies for a raiding expedition required coordination that would challenge modern logistics experts equipped with spreadsheets, databases, and reliable supply chains. Vikings had to accumulate everything they needed for journeys that might last months, using only what they could produce locally, trade for with neighboring communities, or remember to bring from previous expeditions. The supply list was extensive and unforgiving. Forgetting essential items could doom an entire expedition, while bringing too much could overload the ships and make them dangerously unseaworthy. Food supplies were the most critical and challenging aspect of expedition logistics. Warriors needed provisions that would remain edible for months in conditions that included saltwater spray, temperature fluctuations, and the kind of rough handling that was inevitable when everything had to be loaded and unloaded repeatedly during the course of a long voyage. Dried fish, salted meat, hard bread, and cheese were staples, but they all required careful preparation and storage to prevent spoilage. Alcoholic beverages were essential for maintaining morale and treating injuries, but they added significant weight and took up valuable storage space. Water was perhaps the most critical supply challenge because humans can't survive long without fresh water, but water is heavy, takes up enormous amounts of space, and tends to go bad if stored improperly. Vikings had to calculate exactly how much water they would need for drinking, cooking, and cleaning wounds, then figure out how to carry that much liquid in containers that wouldn't leak, break, or contaminate the contents. They also had to plan for opportunities to resupply during the expedition, which meant having detailed knowledge of geography, politics, and the likelihood that coastal communities would be willing to trade rather than fight. Tools and spare equipment represented another supply challenge that required careful planning and difficult compromises. Ships needed spare sails, rope, nails, tar, and wood for repairs that might be necessary far from home. Warriors needed backup weapons, replacement armor components, and medical supplies for treating injuries. The expedition also needed cooking equipment, navigation tools, trade goods for purchasing supplies or information, and materials for constructing temporary shelters when sleeping on land. Selecting crew members for a Viking expedition was a political and practical challenge that combined elements of military recruitment, social networking, and psychological evaluation. The success of a raid depended not just on having enough warriors to overwhelm target communities, but on having the right mix of skills, personalities, and loyalties to function effectively as a team under extreme stress. A badly chosen crew could doom an expedition through incompetence, cowardice, or internal conflict, while a well-selected group could overcome obstacles that would defeat larger but less cohesive forces. Experience was obviously valuable, but it had to be balanced against other considerations. Veterans brought knowledge, skill, and the kind of calm competence that was essential during crisis situations, but they also had their own ideas about tactics, leadership, and resource allocation. Young warriors brought enthusiasm, energy, and the willingness to take risks that sometimes made the difference between success and failure, but they also brought inexperience, overconfidence, and the tendency to make mistakes that could prove costly. Family relationships complicated crew selection in ways that would challenge modern human resources departments. Viking society was built around kinship networks that created obligations, expectations, and loyalties that couldn't be ignored when organizing expeditions. Brothers, cousins, and in-laws often expected to be included in raiding parties, regardless of their qualifications or the practical needs of the expedition. Excluding family members could create long-term political problems that outlasted any single raid, but including incompetent relatives could get everyone killed. Specialized skills were essential, but sometimes difficult to find among available candidates. Every expedition needed someone who understood navigation, someone who could negotiate with foreign communities, someone who knew enough about shipbuilding to handle emergency repairs, and someone who understood enough about medicine to treat injuries and illnesses. These specialists were valuable, but also potentially dangerous if they decided to pursue their own agendas or switched sides during the expedition. The psychology of crew selection was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire process. Viking expeditions were exercises in controlled violence that required men to function effectively in situations that would drive ordinary people insane. Warriors had to be aggressive enough to attack fortified positions and kill strangers in face-to-face combat, but disciplined enough to follow orders, share resources, and resist the temptation to settle personal disputes through violence when the expedition's success depended on group cohesion. Navigation preparation required knowledge that was part science, part art, and part mysticism. Vikings navigated using a combination of astronomical observation, weather pattern recognition, wildlife behavior analysis, and the kind of intuitive understanding of ocean conditions that could only be developed through years of experience. The navigational knowledge had to be memorized because written records were impractical on ships where everything was constantly wet, unstable, and likely to be lost or damaged. Understanding weather patterns was essential for timing departures, selecting routes, and predicting conditions that could make the difference between a successful voyage and a disaster. Vikings learned to read cloud formations, wind directions, wave patterns, and atmospheric conditions in ways that allowed them to predict weather changes days in advance. This knowledge was accumulated through generations of seafaring experience and was as closely guarded as any military secret. Star navigation required memorizing the positions and movements of celestial bodies throughout the year, understanding how these positions changed with latitude, and being able to use this information to determine direction and approximate position, even when visibility was limited. Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for navigation that included the use of crystal sunstones that could detect the sun's position even through heavy cloud cover, though the exact methods they used remain partially mysterious to modern researchers. Religious preparation for Viking expeditions involved rituals, sacrifices, and appeals to gods who were notoriously unpredictable in their responses to human requests. Thor was invoked for protection during sea voyages and strength in battle. Odin was petitioned for wisdom, cunning, and victory, and Frey was asked to provide favorable winds and successful outcomes. These weren't casual prayers whispered in private moments. They were elaborate ceremonies that involved the entire community and often included significant sacrifices of animals, valuable objects, or in extreme cases, human lives. The sacrificial aspects of pre-raid preparation were both practical and spiritual. Animals sacrificed to the gods provided meat for farewell feasts that served important social functions, bringing the community together to support the departing warriors and creating shared experiences that reinforced group bonds. The religious ceremonies also provided psychological benefits for warriors facing the very real possibility that they might not survive their expedition. Divination was another important aspect of religious preparation. Viking communities employed various methods for attempting to predict the outcomes of proposed expeditions, including reading the entrails of sacrificed animals, interpreting the flight patterns of birds, and consulting with individuals who claimed to have special connections to the spirit world. These practices provided a framework for making decisions about timing, routes, and tactics, even if their supernatural effectiveness was questionable. The final weeks before departure were characterized by a frenzy of last-minute preparations, final equipment checks, and the kind of nervous energy that accumulated when dozens of armed men contemplated the imminent prospect of risking their lives in pursuit of wealth and glory. Ships were loaded and reloaded as organizers tried to balance the competing demands of bringing enough supplies without overloading vessels that had to be fast and maneuverable. Weapons received final sharpening and polishing, armor was adjusted and tested, and warriors practiced the kind of coordinated movements that would be essential during actual combat. Family farewells were emotional events that acknowledged the reality that some of the departing warriors would never return home. Wives, children, parents, and siblings gathered to offer blessings, exchange gifts, and share final meals together. These ceremonies served important psychological functions for both the departing warriors and the family members who would spend the coming months wondering whether their loved ones were alive, dead, or simply too far away to send word of their condition. If you think planning a business trip is complicated because you have to coordinate schedules, book accommodations, and remember to pack everything you need for a few days away from home, consider the Vikings who spent months organizing expeditions that combined elements of military deployment, merchant voyage, and extreme sport, all while knowing that success would be measured not just in profit margins, but in body counts, and failure might mean that nobody would ever know what happened to them. The months of preparation that preceded Viking raids were monuments to human determination, ingenuity, and the willingness to invest enormous amounts of time and effort in pursuit of outcomes that were never guaranteed. Yet somehow, these exhaustively planned expeditions continued to attract participants year after year, suggesting that the combination of potential rewards and the simple desire to escape the limitations of longhouse life was powerful enough to overcome even the most realistic assessments of the risks involved. If you think your worst travel experience was that time you got stuck in a middle seat between two people who had never heard of personal hygiene during a 6-hour flight with no air conditioning, imagine spending 3 weeks crammed into a wooden boat, roughly the size of a modern school bus with 35 armed, unwashed warriors who haven't seen a bar of soap since the previous century, while waves the size of buildings try to murder you every few minutes, and your only bathroom facilities consist of hanging your posterior over the side of the ship and hoping you don't fall into an ocean that would kill you in approximately 4 minutes. Welcome to Viking sea travel, where the journey wasn't just part of the adventure, it was an endurance test designed to ensure that only the most psychologically resilient and physically durable warriors would arrive at their destination still capable of coherent thought, let alone organized violence. The transition from confident raider to floating victim of maritime misery typically began before the longship had even cleared the harbor. Vikings who had spent months preparing for their expedition, sharpening weapons, gathering supplies, and mentally preparing for glorious combat, discovered that the North Sea had its own opinions about human ambition and expressed those opinions through a combination of motion sickness, freezing spray, and the kind of relentless physical discomfort that made even the most uncomfortable longhouse seem like a luxury resort by comparison. The first few hours at sea were a cruel education in the difference between theoretical seamanship and the practical reality of trying to maintain human dignity while your inner ear was convinced that the world had been turned upside down and was spinning like a child's top. Seasickness was the great equalizer that reduced legendary warriors to groaning, retching shadows of their former selves. Men who could split shields with a single axe blow, who had faced enemy spears without flinching, who had earned reputations for fearlessness in battle, found themselves clinging to the ship's sides like desperate barnacles, while their stomachs attempted to expel organs that had never actually left their bodies. The irony was cruel and inescapable. Warriors who had spent years training to ignore pain, discomfort, and fear discovered that their minds had no defense against the simple mechanical reality of fluids sloshing around in their inner ears. The seasickness experience aboard a Viking longship was particularly brutal because there was absolutely nowhere to escape the motion. Modern cruise ships use stabilizers, design features, and sheer size to minimize the effects of wave action, but Viking longships were designed for speed, maneuverability, and shallow draft characteristics that made them excellent for raiding, but terrible for passenger comfort. Every wave, every swell, every change in wind direction translated directly into motion that reminded passengers that they were essentially trapped in a floating wooden box at the mercy of forces completely beyond human control. The physical layout of the longship made seasickness even more miserable than it would have been under ideal circumstances. The crew was packed into a narrow space, with no privacy, no personal space, and no opportunity to lie down in a position that might minimize the effects of the ship's motion. Warriors found themselves vomiting in front of their peers, colleagues, and relatives with whom they would need to maintain credible relationships for the duration of the expedition and potentially for years afterward. The psychological humiliation of public seasickness was almost as debilitating as the physical symptoms. Even experienced seafarers weren't immune to the effects of extended time at sea under challenging conditions. Viking longships offered no protection from weather, no relief from the constant motion, and no opportunity for the kind of rest and recovery that might help crew members adapt to maritime conditions. Veterans who had survived multiple voyages still suffered through the initial days of each expedition, though they at least had the consolation of knowing that the misery was temporary and that their bodies would eventually adjust to the ship's motion. The cramped conditions aboard a Viking longship defied every modern assumption about personal space, privacy, and basic human dignity. Imagine trying to share a space roughly the size of a large living room with 35 other adult men, plus all the equipment, weapons, supplies, and cargo necessary for a military expedition that might last for months. Now imagine that this space is constantly in motion, frequently wet, and designed with all the comfort features of a medieval prison cell. The result was a floating social experiment in human tolerance that tested the limits of what people could endure before they started murdering each other out of simple irritation. The sleeping arrangements on a Viking longship were less about comfort and more about finding ways to wedge human bodies into available spaces without creating situations that would result in accidental injury or death. Most crew members slept on the narrow deck spaces between the rowing benches, using their personal gear as pillows and whatever cloaks or blankets they had brought as bedding. The deck was constantly damp from spray, occasionally soaked from waves that broke over the sides, and always hard enough that sleeping required the kind of physical exhaustion that made unconsciousness preferable to continued awareness of the discomfort. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist aboard a Viking longship. Every bodily function, every personal habit, every moment of weakness or vulnerability was observed by dozens of other men who had their own problems to worry about, but couldn't help noticing when their companions were struggling with basic human needs. Warriors learned to develop selective attention, deliberately ignoring things they didn't want to see or hear. But the psychological strain of living without any private space for weeks at a time was significant even for men who had been trained from childhood to suppress emotional responses to discomfort. The bathroom situation aboard a Viking longship was a daily reminder that human dignity was a luxury that couldn't be maintained under maritime conditions. The standard procedure involved hanging off the side of the ship while other crew members tried to pretend they weren't witnessing the process, all while hoping that waves, wind, or simple loss of grip didn't result in an unplanned swimming experience in water that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The process was undignified under the best conditions and genuinely dangerous when the weather was rough or the seas were high. Food and water management on Viking expeditions presented constant challenges that required careful rationing, creative meal planning, and the kind of resignation that comes from knowing that you're going to be hungry and thirsty for weeks, regardless of how carefully you manage your supplies. Fresh water was the most critical resource because humans can't survive long without it, but water was also heavy, took up valuable space, and had a tendency to go bad if stored improperly. Warriors had to balance their immediate thirst against the knowledge that they might need every drop of fresh water they carried before they reached their destination or found opportunities to resupply. The daily water ration was barely enough to maintain basic hydration, let alone provide the luxury of washing or cleaning equipment. Warriors learned to ignore thirst the same way they ignored other forms of discomfort, but extended dehydration affected judgment, stamina, and the ability to function effectively when physical performance mattered most. The psychological pressure of knowing that your water supply was limited and irreplaceable added another layer of stress to an already challenging situation. Food aboard Viking longships was designed for preservation rather than palatability, and the limited cooking facilities meant that most meals consisted of cold, preserved items that required no preparation beyond unwrapping them from whatever material had been used to keep them from spoiling. Dried fish, salted meat, hard bread, and cheese were staples that could survive weeks at sea without refrigeration, but they also represented a monotonous, unappetizing diet that provided calories and basic nutrition without any pretense of culinary enjoyment. Warriors ate because they needed energy to function, not because they expected meals to be pleasant experiences. The cooking facilities on Viking longships were minimal and dangerous. Open fires aboard wooden ships filled with armed men and flammable supplies were obviously problematic, so most hot meals were prepared only when weather conditions and tactical situations permitted the risks involved. When cooking was possible, it typically involved simple stews or broths made from preserved ingredients, heated in metal pots over small, carefully controlled fires that could be extinguished quickly if conditions changed. Navigation during Viking voyages required knowledge, skill, and the kind of intuitive understanding of natural phenomena that could only be developed through years of experience and careful observation. Vikings navigated using a combination of astronomical observation, weather pattern recognition, ocean current analysis, and wildlife behavior interpretation techniques that were effective when applied correctly, but offered no margin for error when mistakes could result in the entire expedition becoming permanently lost at sea. The most reliable navigational tool was the sun, which provided consistent directional reference as long as it was visible and the navigator understood how to compensate for seasonal changes in the sun's apparent position. Vikings used simple but effective techniques for determining approximate latitude by measuring the sun's height at noon, though these calculations required clear skies and calm conditions that weren't always available when navigational information was most urgently needed. Star navigation was essential for maintaining course during night sailing, but it required memorizing the positions and movements of dozens of celestial objects and understanding how these positions changed throughout the year and at different latitudes. Viking navigators developed sophisticated mental maps of the night sky that allowed them to determine direction and approximate position even when visibility was limited by clouds or weather conditions, though this knowledge took years to acquire and was easily lost if not constantly practiced. Weather prediction was perhaps the most critical navigational skill because Viking longships were vulnerable to conditions that larger, more heavily built vessels could weather without serious damage. Experienced navigators learned to read cloud formations, wind patterns, wave characteristics, and atmospheric conditions in ways that allowed them to predict weather changes hours or even days in advance. This knowledge was the difference between reaching shelter before a storm hit and being caught in open water during conditions that could sink the ship or scatter the crew across hundreds of miles of hostile ocean. The psychological challenges of Viking sea voyages were as demanding as the physical hardships and potentially more dangerous because they affected judgment, morale, and group cohesion in ways that could doom entire expeditions. Warriors who had trained for years to suppress fear, pain, and doubt found themselves confronting situations where their mental conditioning offered no protection against the fundamental human terror of drowning, starvation, or simply disappearing into an ocean so vast that their deaths would never be discovered or mourned. The isolation of being at sea for weeks with no contact with land, no news from home, and no way to escape the floating wooden prison they shared with dozens of other, increasingly desperate men, created psychological pressures that tested even the most mentally resilient individuals. Arguments that might have been minor disagreements on land became potentially fatal conflicts when there was no way to separate antagonists and no authority figures who could impose solutions that everyone would accept. The constant awareness of mortality aboard Viking longships was unlike anything most modern people experience. Every storm, every equipment failure, every navigational mistake was a reminder that death was always close, and that survival depended on factors largely beyond human control. Warriors who had faced death in battle knew that combat mortality was at least partly determined by skill, courage, and tactical decisions, but maritime death was more arbitrary and offered fewer opportunities for heroism or meaningful resistance. Storm survival aboard Viking longships required seamanship skills, physical endurance, and the kind of mental toughness that allowed men to continue functioning effectively while convinced that they were probably going to die in the next few hours. North Sea storms could generate waves that dwarfed the longships, winds that could drive a vessel backward faster than the crew could row forward, and conditions that made navigation impossible and survival a matter of luck rather than skill. The physical experience of weathering a major storm in a Viking longship was something that remained burned into the memory of anyone who survived it. The ship would climb wave faces that seemed impossibly steep, pause for terrifying moments at the crest, while the crew wondered if they were about to be pitched into the trough, then plunge down the backside of the wave in a controlled fall that ended with a bone-jarring impact as the bow hit the water. This cycle would repeat for hours, sometimes days, while crew members tried to bail water, maintain equipment, and avoid being washed overboard by waves that broke over the sides with enough force to knock grown men unconscious. The noise of a major storm was as psychologically challenging as the physical violence of the sea. The wind howled with a sound that seemed almost human. The waves crashed against the hull with impacts that transmitted through the wooden planks into the bones of anyone touching the ship, and the rigging screamed and groaned under stresses that threatened to tear the mast away entirely. Combined with the shouting of crew members trying to coordinate their response to the crisis, the overall audio environment was loud enough to prevent normal communication and created a sensory overload that made clear thinking difficult, even for experienced sailors. Sleep during storms was impossible, but extended wakefulness, while under extreme stress, led to hallucinations, poor judgment, and the kind of exhaustion that could prove fatal if it affected critical decisions about navigation, seamanship, or crisis response. Crew members learned to take advantage of any brief periods of calmer weather to rest, eat, and repair equipment, knowing that the next storm might be worse, and that their ability to survive it would depend on their physical and mental condition when it arrived. The approach to enemy coastlines created a different type of psychological pressure that combined anticipation, fear, and the knowledge that the most dangerous part of the expedition was about to begin. Warriors who had survived weeks of maritime hardship now had to prepare mentally for combat, while dealing with the physical effects of extended time at sea, limited nutrition, and the kind of chronic exhaustion that affected reaction times, coordination, and decision-making abilities. Intelligence gathering during the final approach to target areas required careful observation, cautious scouting, and the ability to gather information about enemy defenses, troop movements, and local conditions without revealing the expedition's presence or intentions. Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for coastal reconnaissance that included night landings, small boat scouting missions, and the use of local contacts who could provide information about targets, defenses, and opportunities for surprise attacks. The final hours before a Viking raid were characterized by a combination of nervous energy, weapons checks, and the kind of grim preparation that acknowledged the reality that some of the men who had survived the voyage would not survive the fighting that was about to begin. Warriors who had shared the hardships of the sea voyage, who had supported each other through storms and sickness, now had to prepare for combat, knowing that their success would be measured not just in personal survival, but in their ability to function as a coordinated unit under conditions of extreme violence and chaos. Equipment preparation during the final approach involved checking weapons that had been exposed to salt spray for weeks, testing armor that might have been damaged during the voyage, and making final adjustments to gear that would need to function perfectly when there was no opportunity for repairs or replacements. Warriors who discovered equipment problems during these final inspections faced difficult choices between using damaged gear or going into combat without essential protection. The transition from maritime survival mode to combat readiness required a psychological shift that was as challenging as any of the physical demands of the voyage. Men who had spent weeks focused on enduring discomfort, conserving resources, and simply staying alive now had to transform themselves into aggressive, coordinated fighters capable of overwhelming enemy defenses and achieving tactical objectives while dealing with the physical and mental effects of extended time at sea. If you think your commute is challenging because you have to deal with traffic jams, delayed trains, or the occasional rude passenger, consider the Vikings who spent weeks packed into floating wooden boxes with dozens of other armed, unwashed men while battling seasickness, storms, limited supplies, and the constant awareness that their next meal might be their last, all for the privilege of arriving at destinations where people would try to kill them the moment they stepped ashore. The Viking voyage was less a journey than an ordeal that served as final training for warriors who needed to be tough enough, desperate enough, and psychologically numb enough to succeed in the violent work that awaited them on foreign shores. By the time they reached their targets, they had already survived something that would have broken ordinary men, making them exactly the kind of people you definitely didn't want to see, approaching your coastline with weapons drawn and revenge on their minds. If you think your job is stressful because you have to deal with performance reviews, demanding clients, and the occasional workplace drama, imagine returning from a business trip where success was measured in how many people you killed. Your performance bonus consisted of whatever valuable items you could physically carry while running for your life. And your biggest workplace hazard was the very real possibility that infected wounds from last week's meeting might kill you slowly and painfully over the next month. Welcome to the aftermath of a Viking raid, where victory was just the beginning of a whole new set of problems that made the actual fighting seem like the easy part. Because it turned out that successfully pillaging a monastery, burning a village, or conquering a coastal settlement was merely the opening act in a longer drama that involved dividing stolen goods among armed men who had strong opinions about fairness, treating gruesome injuries with medical techniques that would horrify modern veterinarians, and somehow getting everyone home alive despite the fact that half the crew was now bleeding, traumatized, or dead. The immediate aftermath of a successful Viking raid was less like a victory celebration and more like a frantic military exercise in damage control, crowd management, and primitive emergency medicine. Warriors who had spent hours or days locked in brutal combat, who had risked their lives for the promise of wealth and glory, now discovered that the transition from violence to practical logistics was jarring, anticlimactic, and surprisingly complicated. Men who had been focused entirely on survival and killing suddenly had to shift mental gears and become accountants, medical technicians, and project managers, all while dealing with the physical and psychological effects of recent trauma and the knowledge that they were still far from safety. The first challenge was simply staying alive long enough to enjoy whatever success they had achieved. Viking raids weren't surgical strikes carried out by special forces with modern equipment and medical support. They were violent, chaotic affairs conducted by men armed with medieval weapons, protected by armor that was better than nothing but far from foolproof, and supported by medical knowledge that was largely based on superstition, tradition, and the kind of trial-and-error experimentation that killed as many patients as it saved. Warriors who had survived the actual fighting often discovered that their real battle for survival was just beginning. Wound assessment in the immediate aftermath of a raid was a grim exercise in triage that would challenge modern emergency room doctors equipped with X-ray machines, antibiotics, and comprehensive trauma training. Viking warriors had to evaluate injuries using nothing but visual inspection, basic understanding of anatomy, and the kind of practical experience that came from seeing a lot of people get hurt in creative ways. They learned to distinguish between wounds that would heal on their own, wounds that required immediate treatment to prevent death from blood loss, and wounds that were essentially death sentences, regardless of what medical intervention might be attempted. The most immediate concern was controlling bleeding from serious wounds, which Vikings accomplished using techniques that were sometimes effective, occasionally helpful, and frequently disastrous. Pressure bandages made from whatever cloth was available could stop bleeding from minor cuts and moderate wounds, but they required materials that were often in short supply and time that might not be available if the raiding party was still in danger from pursuing enemies or needed to evacuate quickly from hostile territory. Cauterization with hot metal was the standard treatment for serious bleeding that couldn't be controlled through pressure alone, a procedure that involved heating knife blades, spear points, or specialized tools in fires until they were red hot, then pressing the glowing metal against open wounds to sear the blood vessels closed. This technique was agonizingly painful, frequently led to serious infections, and sometimes caused more tissue damage than the original wound, but it could save lives when blood loss was the immediate threat to survival. The pain management options available to wounded Vikings were limited, ineffective, and often more dangerous than helpful. Alcohol was the primary anesthetic, which meant that seriously wounded warriors were often drunk during medical procedures, leading to complications that included vomiting while unconscious, increased bleeding due to alcohol's effects on blood clotting, and the kind of poor decision-making that comes from combining severe pain with significant intoxication. Some herbal remedies were available, but their effectiveness was questionable, and their safety was largely unknown. Infection was the silent killer that claimed more Viking lives than enemy weapons, starvation, or exposure combined. Warriors who survived the initial trauma of their wounds often died weeks later from infections that turned minor cuts into festering, gangrenous disasters that spread throughout their bodies like slow-acting poison. Vikings had no understanding of bacteria, no antibiotics, and no sterile procedures, which meant that even minor wounds could become fatal if contaminated by dirt, clothing fibers, or the unwashed hands of well-meaning companions trying to provide medical assistance. The standard treatment for infected wounds involved cleaning with whatever liquids were available, usually water, wine, or ale, followed by the application of various poultices, salves, and herbal preparations that were based more on tradition and wishful thinking than actual medical knowledge. Some of these treatments were genuinely helpful. Honey, for example, has natural antibacterial properties that could slow infection in minor wounds. Others were neutral or actively harmful, accelerating infection or causing additional tissue damage that made recovery more difficult. Amputation was the final option for seriously infected limbs, a procedure that Vikings performed with the same tools they used for combat: sharp knives, axes, and saws that were cleaned as well as possible, but were never truly sterile. The survival rate for battlefield amputations was extremely low, partly because of blood loss and shock, partly because of infection, and partly because the procedures were performed by people whose medical training consisted of having watched other people attempt similar operations with varying degrees of success. Even successful amputations created long-term problems that affected not just the individual warrior, but his family and community. A Viking who lost an arm or leg in combat became a burden rather than an asset, requiring support from relatives who might already be struggling to survive on limited resources. The psychological adjustment to disability was complicated by a warrior culture that valued physical prowess and the ability to contribute to military expeditions, creating social dynamics that were often more painful than the original injuries. The division of plunder after a successful raid was a diplomatic challenge that tested the leadership skills of expedition commanders and the self-control of warriors who had risked their lives for the promise of wealth, but now had to trust others to distribute that wealth fairly. The process involved complex calculations that considered the relative contributions of different participants, the practical challenges of transporting various types of loot, and the political necessity of maintaining group cohesion among armed men who had strong opinions about what constituted fair compensation for their efforts. The most valuable plunder consisted of precious metals, gems, and coins that were portable, universally valuable, and easy to divide among multiple claimants. Gold and silver could be melted down and reformed into equal portions, though this required equipment and expertise that weren't always available in the field. Coins could be counted and distributed mathematically, though disputes often arose about the relative values of different denominations and currencies from various regions. Practical goods like weapons, armor, tools, and clothing presented different distribution challenges because their values were subjective and their utility depended on individual needs and preferences. A high-quality sword might be worth more than its weight in silver to a warrior whose own weapon had been damaged or lost, but it was useless to someone who already had better equipment. Clothing and textiles were valuable for trade, but bulky to transport, creating logistical problems that had to be balanced against their potential worth. Livestock presented the most complex distribution challenges because animals were valuable, but impossible to divide equally among multiple claimants. Cattle, horses, sheep, and pigs could be traded for other goods or transported back to Scandinavia, but they required food, water, and care during the journey home, adding to the expedition's logistical burden and reducing the space available for other types of plunder. Some expeditions solved this problem by selling livestock to local buyers before departing, though finding trustworthy purchasers in recently raided territories was often difficult. The human cargo captured during raid slaves, who would be sold in Scandinavian markets or used as laborers by individual family, created the most morally complex and practically challenging aspects of plunder distribution. Slaves were valuable property in Viking society, but they were also human beings who required food, supervision, and restraint during the journey home. They could escape, resist, or simply die from the hardships of travel, turning valuable assets into worthless burdens that consumed resources without providing any return on the investment. The leadership responsibilities involved in managing post-raid logistics were enormous and largely thankless. Expedition commanders had to make decisions about medical treatment, resource allocation, and tactical planning while dealing with wounded, exhausted, traumatized warriors who might not be thinking clearly, but still had weapons and strong opinions about how things should be handled. The stress of command during the aftermath of a raid was often more challenging than leadership during the actual fighting, because combat at least provided clear objectives and immediate feedback about the effectiveness of decisions. The psychological aftermath of Viking raids affected even successful warriors in ways that wouldn't be understood or addressed for centuries. Men who had killed other human beings in face-to-face combat, who had watched friends die violently, who had participated in the destruction of communities and the enslavement of civilians, carried psychological scars that influenced their behavior, relationships, and mental health for the rest of their lives. Viking society provided no framework for understanding or treating what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other psychological consequences of repeated exposure to extreme violence. The social pressure to maintain a warrior's reputation after returning from raids created additional psychological stress that compounded the effects of combat trauma. Warriors were expected to display courage, competence, and emotional resilience, regardless of what they had experienced or how they actually felt about their actions. Showing weakness, expressing doubt, or demonstrating emotional distress could damage a warrior's social standing and reduce his opportunities for marriage, political advancement, and inclusion in future expeditions. The burden of supporting families with the proceeds from raiding expeditions created economic pressure that forced many warriors to continue participating in dangerous activities long after they had lost their enthusiasm for violence, adventure. Men who had families depending on them for survival couldn't afford to retire from raiding until they had accumulated enough wealth to provide long-term security, but the risks of continued participation increased with age as reflexes slowed, strength diminished, and accumulated injuries reduced their effectiveness in combat. The journey home, after a successful raid, presented new challenges that were different from, but potentially as dangerous as the outbound voyage. Ships that had been overloaded with plunder were less maneuverable and more vulnerable to storms, while crews that included wounded, traumatized, and exhausted warriors were less capable of responding effectively to emergencies. The return voyage often took longer than the outbound journey because commanders had to account for reduced crew effectiveness and the additional weight of cargo that affected the ship's performance in rough weather. Navigation during the return journey was complicated by the need to avoid pursuit by enemies who might attempt to intercept the raiding party and recover stolen goods. This meant taking indirect routes that added time and distance to the voyage, while reducing opportunities to resupply with fresh water and food. Warriors who had survived the raid and the initial aftermath now faced weeks of additional hardship that tested their endurance and increased their chances of dying from infection, malnutrition, or simple exhaustion before they could reach safety. The medical challenges of caring for wounded warriors during the return voyage were particularly difficult because the ship's environment was hostile to healing and recovery. Salt spray, constant motion, cramped conditions, and limited supplies of clean water and fresh food created conditions that promoted infection and prevented proper rest. Warriors who might have recovered from their wounds under better conditions often died during the return journey, turning successful raids into bitter experiences that left surviving crew members wondering whether the costs had been worth the benefits. The economic realities of Viking raiding became more apparent during the return journey as expedition members calculated the actual value of their efforts against the costs of participation. Warriors had to account for lost equipment, medical expenses, and the opportunity costs of spending months away from their farms and families. Many discovered that their share of the plunder, while better than nothing, wasn't enough to provide long-term security or significantly improve their living conditions. The social dynamics of returning raiding parties were influenced by the success or failure of their expeditions in ways that affected community relationships for years afterward. Successful raids enhanced the reputations of participants and their families, creating opportunities for advantageous marriages, political alliances, and inclusion in future expeditions. Failed raids had the opposite effect, damaging the social standing of survivors and reducing their access to resources and opportunities. The aging warrior's dilemma became more acute with each passing year as men who had built their identities around physical prowess and military achievement faced the inevitable decline of their capabilities. Warriors in their 30s and 40s found themselves competing with younger men who were stronger, faster, and more aggressive, while dealing with the accumulated effects of years of combat injuries, harsh living conditions, and psychological stress. The transition from active raider to retired veteran was often difficult and sometimes impossible for men whose entire sense of self-worth was tied to their ability to function as warriors. Some aging warriors attempted to extend their careers by specializing in roles that emphasized experience and knowledge rather than physical capability. They became navigators, tacticians, or expedition organizers whose contributions were valuable but less directly dangerous than frontline combat. Others invested their accumulated wealth in trade, farming, or other economic activities that provided income without requiring continued participation in military expeditions. The most successful aging warriors were those who managed to accumulate enough wealth and social connections to become leaders and organizers of expeditions rather than ordinary participants. These men could continue to benefit from raiding activities while reducing their personal exposure to physical danger, though they still faced the risks and responsibilities associated with command positions. The transition from warrior to war leader required political skills, economic resources, and social connections that not every successful fighter possessed. The families of Viking warriors faced their own challenges during the aftermath of raiding expeditions, dealing with wounded, traumatized men who had been changed by their experiences in ways that affected family relationships and domestic life. Wives and children often found themselves living with men who were physically damaged, psychologically scarred, or simply different from the people who had departed months earlier. The readjustment to domestic life, after extended periods of violence and hardship, was difficult for warriors and their families alike. The economic benefits of successful raids had to be balanced against the long-term costs of participating in dangerous expeditions that frequently resulted in injury, disability, or death. Families that lost their primary breadwinners to raiding activities often faced poverty and social marginalization, while those whose warriors returned, wounded, or disabled, had to provide care and support for men who could no longer contribute to household productivity. The cycle of raiding and recovery created patterns of behavior that influenced entire communities and generations of warriors. Young men grew up watching older relatives prepare for, participate in, and recover from violent expeditions that were presented as necessary for survival and prosperity, but often resulted in trauma, loss, and disappointment. The cultural pressure to prove themselves as warriors pushed each new generation into the same patterns of risk-taking and violence that had shaped their predecessors. If you think your job performance review is stressful because you have to justify your productivity metrics and explain why you didn't meet certain quarterly targets, consider the Viking warrior who had to return home and explain to his wife why half the expedition died of infection, why his share of the plunder barely covered the cost of replacing his damaged equipment, and why he was probably going to have to do it all again next year, because the alternative was watching his family slowly starve during the next long winter. The aftermath of Viking raids revealed the brutal economic reality behind the romantic mythology of warrior culture. For every saga, worthy adventure that ended in glory and wealth, there were dozens of expeditions that concluded with wounded, exhausted men limping home with barely enough plunder to justify the risks they had taken, forced to begin planning their next desperate gamble before they had even finished treating the wounds from their last one.